What's up, guys? The Joyful Josh.
And the radical Raiden are going over the role structural racism had on the Bronx.
And in the long run, hip hop.
The South Bronx is an area of New York City borough of the Bronx.
Around the late 1940s, there was a large migration of Puerto Ricans and African Americans who were looking for a better life or area to live. The South Bronx was pretty much a close to ideal society where people joined hands no matter their origin. The community was clean and the people there looked out for each other.
Dude, that sounds like a radical place to be living at then. But how does that connect to hip-hop? And why?
Well, it's a long story, and maybe one that we're already familiar with. Unfortunately, back then, racism was very common and mostly unpunished. It wasn't uncommon for the higher-ups in society to use their power to keep those of color beneath them.
How did they manage to do that to the South Bronx, though?
They utilized something called institutionalized racism.
Instantaneous racism?
Brother, what?
When it comes to pronunciation, I'm the guy to come to. The most awesome guy you ever know is Raiden Stormbringer. Learning this word would be easy peasy.
Yo, I'll actually pay anybody to tell me what's going on here. But the pronunciation master, Dr. Joe. Institute. What?
Toot.
Ah, dude! Institutional.
Inspirational.
Institutional.
Insensational.
Institutional.
Instagram-minial?
Dude, that's not even a word! Anyway, institutional racism was used to harm the Bronx, but the starting point was actually structural racism by redlining, because it was one of the first stages that started the downfall of the Bronx.
Structural, institutional, redlining? What's even the difference between them? And what's redlining?
Well, structural and institutional racism are just the highest two of 4 levels of racism. And as for your second question, redlining is an example of structural racism, a system in which public policies, institutional practices, and cultural norms work together to perpetuate racial inequality.
How did it hurt the South Bronx?
Well, redlining had government-created maps that marked minority-occupied areas as red or hazardous, leading to divestment and limited wealth-building opportunities. Because banks and lenders denied mortgages and other services to neighborhoods in the Bronx that were outlined in red on government maps, it led to a lack of investment, making the value of buildings and impacting the environment due to reduced green spaces.
That's a lot different from what I thought. I heard that the people there were basically doing it to themselves, setting their places on fire, leaving trash everywhere, and that the people there were violent and dangerous.
And that's where the instructional part comes in. While redlining started devaluating the Bronx, the people in power used the residents for either their own financial or political gain, like Robert Moses, for example, who displaced thousands of people with his expressway without any concern to the community. The conditions made things dirty, and there was basically a dump in the backyard. Lots of buildings were abandoned, vandalism was common, which included activities like graffiti and gang violence ensued as well. The residents were treated every day as if they were nothing, and there was lots of neglect towards the city. There wasn't a lot of support for the youth either, as they either ended up on drugs or dropped out or even died. And unfortunately, due to the decline of the economy in the Bronx, jobs were lost and teenagers needed money. Who else to get it from than the landlords who, at this point, saw the buildings that they owned no longer had value to them anymore and would bribe the gangs to burn them down with money. Not that it mattered anyway. The landlords were kind of cruel with their tenants, not having good AC, failing to look at their repairs, and pretty much stealing money away from their tenants. Even when the perpetrators were caught, none of the landlords were ever punished. It was only just the teenagers that actually committed the crime.
And because a lot of them were teenagers of color, they're stereotyped as naturally violent kids, right? And that's why the people of the South Bronx were made to look like idiots that were torched down their own places.
Precisely. The residents of the South Bronx began to live in terrible times. Fires, arson, vandalism, and gang violence became commonplace. To top it all off, despite the multiple fires that took place in the South Bronx, multiple fire stations nearby were shut down, forcing the residents to have to save themselves. Meanwhile, places with statistically less fires had none of their stations touched, but also increased in number. And while the government used it for political gain, the answer to what was going on was pretty much, don't worry about it.
Sheesh, that was pretty harsh.
Yeah, but now you're probably wondering how it had led to a cool thing like hip hop.
Well, I heard that it came from the voices of the unheard.
Well, yeah, actually. The suffering and the conditions that the residents lived in actually pushed them closer together. The lack of private space created a high concentration of people whose cultures cross-pollinated and resulted in the four elements of hip-hop, like DJing, MCing, b-boying, and graffiti. While hip-hop lyrics reflected the social and economic conditions of the inner city of the people who lived there. Though this started the rise of hip-hop from underground music to one of the most popular genres in the world.
Okay, that was a lot to process. You think we can get a recap on how institutional racism contributed to the development of hip-hop?
Well, to start, the lack of private space created a high concentration of people whose cultures cross-pollinated and resulted in the four elements of hip-hop. Vandalism became common through graffiti, which is one of hip-hop's key elements. Gangs formed in the Bronx because of the conditions made by institutional racism, and became connected because hip-hop and gangs were made from said conditions. And it made the conditions that turned hip-hop into a kind of creative response to systemic oppression.
So that brings up the question, to what extent was the situation in South Bronx a result of structural racism that's contributing to the creation of hip-hop culture?
My opinion is that structural racism did play a part in the South Bronx, but more of a domino effect on its contributions to hip-hop culture, while institutional racism contributed more to hip-hop because of its consistency. So, in a way, it was really kind of both. But with that, that's the Joyful Josh.
And the radical Raiden.
And we'll
see
see
you
next
next
time.
time.